last discussion, we discussed pitch, how to identify pitches on a staff using a clef. Using a clef to tell us that this is G3, this would be A3, B3, C4, and in the bass clef, this would be F2, E2, D2, C2, C2, B1. So we can identify both pitch name and also register by using the staff and the clef. Now today we're going to learn how our system is actually divided. As I said before in the last section, our staff divides our scale into 7 discrete steps. However, these steps are not all identical. Listen to the first 3. Listen to the first 2. And listen to the second one. Do they sound the same? Hopefully your ears are getting sharp enough that you realize the distance between these 2 pitches and these 2 was not identical. It was different. In fact, we have larger steps and we have smaller steps, how we divided it up into small steps and large steps. Our large steps are called whole steps, and our small steps are called half steps, and you understand why in just a moment. Whole steps are the larger ones, half ones are the smaller ones. Sounds large, whole step. Sounds small, half step. Sounds large, whole step. Sound like a whole step again. Now that sounded smaller, so that's a half step. Sounds like a whole larger one, so a whole step. And that sounded large as well. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step. So not all are alike. There's a very easy way to memorize which steps are half steps and whole steps on a staff. It's very simple. Between A and B is a whole step, between A and B is a whole step, and between C and D is a whole step, D and E is a whole step, between F and G is a whole step, and between G and A is a whole step. However, between B and C, we have a half step, and between E and F, we have a half step. So just remember, it's all whole steps except between B and C and E and F. All you need to remember, and that way we know exactly where it is on a staff are the half steps and whole steps. If I'm in the bass clef, my half steps are between E and F, and between B and C. All right, so what is the difference in the relationship between half steps and whole steps? Here again, let's use our ears and use the piano to help us. Here's our half step. You hear that? Now listen to whole step. All right, it's bigger. How about if I fill it in between? Now use your ears again. That was A to B. Something in between. Now listen to B to C. B to C. A to B. And B to C. Can you hear that the division of our whole step, that thing I put in between A and B, was the same size? Sounded very similar to what was between B and C. And in fact, in our system, all whole steps are made up of 2 half steps. All are made up of 2 half steps. Half step, whole step. Half step, whole step. Okay, so our whole step and half step are how we divide up our system. 7 discrete pieces. Between A and B, there's a whole step. Between B and C, there's a half step. Between C and D, there's a whole step. D and E, there's a whole step. E and F, or D and E, there's a whole step. E and F is a half step. F and G, whole step, and then back to A whole step. And each one of these whole steps can be divided up into 2 halves. Well then, how exactly do I indicate the half step in between if I want to hear that pitch? As you can hear, we can have them. We can have those half steps. Well, I have to designate that. I have to write it in some way. In this sense then, if you count up half steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, we have half steps between 13 half steps in our system of 7 notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 8. But if their half steps are, if we cut our whole steps in half, you hear that? We have 13 half steps in our system, and of that we can combine some half steps into a whole step and get 7 separate steps. Okay, how then do I designate that there's a half step between A and B? There are 2 ways to do it. For right now, we're going to say they're equivalent, but they will not be in the future. For right now, we just need to know that they can be expressed right at this point as in 2 separate ways. One way is I can say something is a half step larger than A. The other way is to say something is a half step smaller than B. That spot in the middle is either a half step higher than A or a half step lower than B. How we designate that is with what we refer to as an accidental. There are 3 types, 3 accidentals. One is a shock. A shock means raise that by 1 half step. Raise by 1 half step. Up by 1 half step. The other is a flat, and that means lower it by 1 half step. Raise by 1 half step, sharp. Lower by 1 half step, flat. We also use what's called a neutral, and that usually cancels out a sharp or a flat, or is indicated to sometimes to make sure we actually understand what pitch it is. No, that's not a sharp. No, it's not a flat. It is instead a natural. So there are 2 ways I can do this. Indicate the pitch between A and B. One is to say that's a half a step higher than A. That would be an A sharp. Or I can say that's a half step lower than B. That's a B flat. So this would be A3. This would be marked A sharp 3. This would be B3. This would be marked B flat 3. The pitch between A and B is either A sharp or B flat. In this sense, and for right now, they are considered the same thing. Now, later on, they will not be the same thing at all. We will learn there's a big difference in a performance of the piece between performing an A sharp and B flat. Big difference. But for right now, they are considered the same or enharmonically equivalent. Enharmonically equivalent. So, to indicate then, if we are wanting, for example, take another one, between C and D, the half step in between C and D, we can create C2, a C sharp, or we can write that as a D flat. And that indicates then either sharp or flat, but it indicates the half step in between. Note, there is no half step again between E and F or B and C. And we will discuss what you do in that case if you want a half step above B at some later date. In that sense, our scale, our dividing up of our octave into 7 discrete sections, which we would call steps, it consists of half steps and whole steps. And in between the whole steps, we can have a half step, half step, half step, none there, half step, and half step. Or a have a half step, none there, a half step, a half step, none there, a half step, and a half step. Now, if I have a flat there, and this is a B natural, this is no longer flatted, I need that natural sign. Natural sign. Natural sign. Natural sign. Natural. So this would be A, B flat, A1, B flat 1, B1. For example, if I see this pitch right here, first off, I know it is a D. I know it's a D sharp. I know since this is C3, that's C4, then it's D sharp 4. Here we have what is obviously a G flat. Since this is C3, that's C2, that must be G flat 1. Okay. Lastly, if we have a need in our music to have a D flat, and then there's a D natural right after that, on the music page, if it's within a measure, we'll get to discuss what that is, you must put a natural sign in front of it, so I know that's a D natural. Otherwise, it's confusing. Otherwise, it would be D flat, D flat. However, it's D flat, D